Welcome back to another episode of The Canon on the Boomer Bust channel. I'm your host, Terry, and today we are going to start the work to answer a very, very important and long-standing question. Who has the better rogue gallery between Batman and Spider-Man? And so this is a little Marvel versus DC action going on. But a couple things before we get started. Number one, of course, this is my opinion. This is not me telling you what to think. This is just my point of view and the way I see things. So you are definitely welcome to push back and put your own ideas in the comments. Secondly, these are the people that I consider most famously, in the rogue gallery. So there's obviously other villains, but I think these are the top ones. And so there's 15 on each side. And I'm going to break the episodes up into 3 parts. So we're going to do 5 villains each time, or 5 groups each time. And so, although the villains will be pitted against each other, it's mainly to allow me to talk about 2 people at once. And it's a non-zero sum game. So whatever points I give to one, it doesn't affect the other. They're all individually judged. So it's not necessarily like, you know, that villain versus that villain. It's just a way for me to talk about both of them at the same time. And with that being said, I'll be looking at 3 main factors: the backstory of the villain, the threat level of the villain to their hero. So if I'm talking about Penguin, I'm talking about him versus Batman, not him versus Spider-Man. So what threat he poses to that hero, and other heroes could be brought into it as well from that universe. And then lastly, popularity. I think it'd be silly not to include that. Not just popularity within the comics, but overall in the pop culture. We got a lot of different mediums now for superheroes and comic books and villains. So bringing that into it as well. Then we'll get an overall score. And so at the end of this whole 3-part series, we'll add it all up and see who has the highest total. So that's how we'll kind of go. All right, so let's kick this off with Penguin versus Kingpin. And so Penguin, for me, backstory, I gave an 8. I really like Penguin's backstory. And again, these can be a bunch of different ones, but I try to stick to the common ones. And so Penguin most commonly came up through crime to work his way up. So being a low level, whatever he was, committing these crimes, obviously very smart and understands how to put on a caper, as they say. And so that earned him some respect. He got up there. He did some dirt, killed some people, and took over and became a self-made, crime boss mostly. And so I really like that in general, but also as we've seen a little bit in Gotham, and a lot of people are excited about with the movie coming up, the Batman, they think there's a lot of richness that you can get out of that character there. So it'll be interesting. And I like the idea, that we throw away this idea that he's actually a penguin or morphed into a penguin. Like he just, resembles one, and so they made fun of him, but he's not like a penguin. Threat level, I gave him a 7. I think he has the difference between him and some of the other smart villains is that he is a killer. He's not afraid to kill. Obviously, they all want to kill Batman, but he's not afraid to kill other people around or Batman's people to get what he wants. And then obviously he has a pretty good reach and resources because he is one of the more top bosses out there. So I give him a 7. But obviously, if you get hand to hand with Batman or anything, or if Batman gets close to you as a penguin, it's over. So really it's about him orchestrating things around Batman to, keep him occupied. Popularity, I gave him an 8. I mean, Penguin's pretty well known when you talk about villains. Like he's been around for the longest. Obviously, the Danny DeVito is a very popular depiction. As I mentioned with the show Gotham, he kind of had a return and interest in this whole Cobblepot thing. and then we'll see him coming up in the Batman. But yeah, I mean, it's just kind of an iconic look, which might be changing in the movie. But really, when you think of Penguin, I think if you talk to most people, they would know who that is. So overall, I think that averages out to a 7.7. Now we got Kingpin. So Kingpin backstory, I gave an 8, which is very similar, to the Penguin, where he kind of came up and became self-made as a crime boss. But the thing with Kingpin, he operates out of New York, but it stretches kind of everywhere. He runs a lot of stuff, and very similar. He's reminiscent of Lex Luthor. Except he has obviously the physical part to him, but Kingpin again. You think about stuff that you've seen recently. You could have his own show, like his own movie or whatever, just talking about that gritty crime life and how he came up to become what he is. So really interesting to me. Threat level, I gave him a 10. So again, I think similar to Penguin, he's got a lot of resources, but even more. Again, it's not just New York. He's got resources all over, and he's really manipulative. He knows how to get people to do what he wants, and he knows how to get them caught up in the situation where they have to do what he's ordering them to do. But at the end of the day, if you were to fight him, like a Spider-Man, he's stronger than Spider-Man. And I will say part of the backstory that doesn't make sense as much to me is why he's so strong. And they're like, he looks fat, but he's strong. But he's trained in a lot of different things. He's a person that can fight, but he's supposedly just really super strong. And so we've seen that depiction. And so I think if it all comes down to it, Kingpin could go toe-to-toe with Spider-Man, and similarly like you've seen him in Daredevil. But yeah, so I think his threat is not just mental, it's not just physical, it's not just resources, it's all of those. And so I think for a Spider-Man villain, it's a 10, Popularity, I gave an 8. I think, again, you've seen him in that Daredevil movie. And the thing about Kingpin is he started off very much a Spider-Man villain and still is, but he branched off to be a Daredevil villain as well. So you've seen him in multiple things. We've seen him in the TV show. We've seen him in a Daredevil movie, but we also seen him in, Into the Spider-Verse recently. And so Kingpin, I think, is pretty much a synonymous name. You know that character, and not everybody might not like him, but I think his popularity has boosted up recently. So overall, that's an 8.7, 1 point lead over the Penguin. All right, so we will go to our next one, which is Clayface versus Sandman. So Clayface, I gave a 6. Now, this is definitely one of those characters that has all types of different backgrounds out there. I like the animated series one where they kind of melded two different ones together. But the original Clayface was an actor, and he also was an actor in the animated series. And basically, he gets into an accident, kind of deforms his face, and they use this experimental cream or whatever from one of these companies, pharmaceutical companies, and it kind of helps him reconfigure his face, but he has to continually use it. And then he tries to steal some, and then they catch him and fill him up with all this cream until he dies. Well, they think he dies, but it just transforms him. And his original story, he didn't have any powers. He just wore a mask. He was mad that he didn't get a movie, and he wore a mask similar to a killer that he played in a horror movie, and he killed the cast of the movie and everything. So, I mean, again, you could kind of play it either way, but for me, I like the one from Batman, the animated series, and it's really interesting. Now, it is a large leap to get to where they did as far as all his powers, but this idea of an actor to me and all that, it was just a little different. So, especially when it's a pharmaceutical company that kind of did it to him. So, it's kind of interesting to me. Threat level, I gave a 9 because he can shapeshift. So he could look like other people. He could change his body into weapons. He can be solid. He can be more liquid. He's a really tough opponent, and so there's a lot that he can do with that, you know, that can really give Batman trouble. Obviously, he can't hold it forever, and there's ways to disrupt them. But for the most part, Clayface throws a lot of different, you know, threats out there. And I think that's definitely shown because he eventually becomes kind of like an anti-hero as well. So popularity for me, I gave a 5. And I think is rising. Like, again, being attached to the animated series gives you a boost, but you never really seen Clayface, and it's pretty hard to do live action. So we don't really see him outside of that TV show. But again, like I was saying in the comics, he's starting to come up prominence as he's turned over to the other side. And he's always been more of a sympathetic type character. And so he's really, I guess you call him anti-hero, but he's kind of part of the Bat family and the New 52. And so I think the popularity is about average there, though. I wouldn't say the average person knows who he is. So that goes to a 6.7. Sandman, backstory, I gave a 6. And again, it can be different, but basically he's kind of a low-level criminal, and then he escapes from prison and escapes to a nearby, like, I'm not sure what you call it, but he ended up in some sand that was radiated, and it mixed with his molecules and turned him into the Sandman. And similarly to Spider-Man 3, the movie, if you think about that, kind of very similar to that. But very similar to Clayface, he's able to change his body and do all these different things. And he's not able to shapeshift into people, so he can't do that, but he can, like, change his body to weapons. He can, you know, make himself more solid or less solid, all those different things. But the backstory, I mean, with the radiated sand, like, okay, but other than that, it doesn't really give a real reason why he becomes a villain. That's other part of the backstory. Like with Clayface, he's just trying to get back, you know, and get revenge. With Sandman, I mean, he already was kind of criminal, and I know recently they've changed it a little bit, and even in Spider-Man 3, they kind of changed it to where he is more of a, you know, sympathetic type, and they're both that way. So, you know, anyway, I gave it a 6. I think it was above average. So threat level, I gave it an 8. Very similar to Clayface, except he can't shapeshift. So that adds a very different, you know, level of things when you can look like somebody else and trick other people. So it's not just tricking Spider-Man, but you can trick other people against Spider-Man or whatever. And so Sandman can't really do that. So I gave him an 8, but everything else stands. You know, he can be solid. He can escape. He can, you know, it can be hard to hit him, but he does have those kind of natural weaknesses with the fire and turning him to glass and stuff like that. So gave him an 8, though. That's a pretty hard person to fight. I mean, even if you think about Spider-Man 3, the movie, eventually it wasn't even Spider-Man that was fighting him. It was Harry Osborn as the Hobgoblin. Popularity, I give a 4. As I mentioned, Spider-Man 3 is where we saw him, but that movie does not have a good connotation in the fandom, and so that works kind of against him. And then also a little bit in the animated series, but really he's not one of the top tier villains for Spider-Man. So if you said Sandman, especially because there's a DC Sandman from Vertigo, I don't know that a lot of people would know who that is. So I'll give him overall 6 is what it averaged out to. Well, popularity is 4, averages out to a 6. Okay, so let's move to Riddler versus Mysterio. So Riddler, I gave a 4 on the backstory. It's kind of flimsy. It's just like, yeah, he's really smart and he's fascinated with puzzles and riddles. And it really does not give a lot, especially his original origin, to why he's against Batman. it just seems like, and he's not even particularly really into crime. It's just like he wants to match wits with Batman and show that he's a superior intelligence. And so that's just kind of surface to me. So I gave it a 4. Threat levels is 6 because I think mentally we know Riddler is probably one of the top tier at pushing Batman to mentally figuring out things. And really when he sets it up, it does become annoying. I'm just thinking about the Arkham games where like if it's a countdown, you got to figure out these puzzles and all this stuff. So Riddler can be a very tough person, especially if you're thinking about Batman. You know, he don't have a restart button. He's just in the moment. He has to figure it out now. So, but again, if you get to Riddler, it's over. Riddler can't do anything to Batman. So this is purely off his mental ability. I gave him a 6. Popularity, I gave him an 8. Riddler's been everywhere. I mean, since the beginning. Very iconic look with the green and the question mark. So a lot of people know him, Edward Nygma. And then even in Gotham, he's gained a new popularity. Some people were saying in comics, like he reformed and was a detective. And then in Gotham, it was pre-Riddler. So you saw him working with GPD, which is their own story. But he was kind of a detective. And so using that smarts, he kind of feels like a little bit of a Batman. And so I think he's gaining a lot more popularity. And then we'll hopefully get to see him in the upcoming Batman movies. So I think Riddler is one of those people famously portrayed by Jim Carrey. Also, it's just one of those villains that's really iconic, I think. But that averages out to a 6 for him. Mysterio, backstory, 5. A little bit more fleshed out. I think that the idea of a special effects guy in Hollywood is kind of cool because it's different. But other than that, like, it's funny because I just watched this episode on the TV show. But so basically, he messes up. He does something that he shouldn't have did. He gets caught and in trouble by Spider-Man, but he blames Spider-Man. And so it's clearly his fault, but whatever. He's a loose cannon. But after that, after he gets out of jail, whatever, he just goes and turns his ability with special effects to this crazy amount of stuff that he can do. And so I get the connection with Spider-Man. I get the connection with him being a villain per se, because, you know, he's just somebody that's loose in the mind, as they try to do. But it's just a leap from being a Hollywood special effects person, even a really good one, to doing what Mysterio does. Mysterio does like some next level crazy stuff. And I feel like it made more sense in Spider-Man Far From Home when they made him Stark Industries employee. So that at least he had more advanced stuff that made a little more sense. But his original origin is as special effects guy. So I gave it a 5. Threat, I gave it a 9. Again, talking about Far From Home, just looking at anything, he can be very powerful and is ultimately more powerful than Spider-Man, because for a long time his spider senses didn't really go off because things weren't actually there. And so it made it really hard for Spider-Man to figure out what was coming at him, and they used that in Far From Home as well. And so Mysterio became a very convincing villain for that reason, but also the way he's able to trick other people. So he famously started off in his first issue, or his first appearance, by framing Spider-Man, and then they do that again in the TV show. And so his ability to do those things and to be convincing about it, especially if you're talking about a 2020 Mysterio with this type of technology, it can really trick some people against other people or really like misdirect you. And honestly, if Spider-Man can't use his spider sense, then you can't really hope other people to see through Mysterio's illusions either. So he's a pretty threatening villain. Popularity, I give a 5 solely. Now, he has that look, and then he's prominent in the animated series and the Sinister Six. But I think mostly having that movie come out recently, more people know about who he is. But for the most part, I don't think Mysterio is like an iconic villain for a lot of people. Like the look you might know, and the name sounds cool, but you know, there's other Mysterios, Rey Mysterio. So I wouldn't say he's iconic, but that averages out to a 6.3 for him. Excuse me. All right, so our next matchup is Two-Face versus Green Goblin. So Two-Face backstory, I gave a 7. Again, I would say it's similar, but I like to look at the animated series one. But similar to his original, basically he's well, sometimes he's a lawyer, sometimes he's the DA, but defense attorney for Gotham. And then he is burnt at a trial in a court. Obviously, in The Dark Knight, they changed that up and mixed it up with the Joker. But his original is that one of the guys that he's trying to put in jail throws some acid on him and burns like half his face. And then they say he goes crazy. In the animated series, they show that Two-Face already had Harvey Dent had like a split personality disorder, and he had a lot of dark things that was hidden in them. And Two-Face was already kind of this alternative persona. And once that accident happened, it kind of unlocked it and allowed it to come out and take over. So you got some good psychology there, much like a Hulk or Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, all that stuff. Now, him turning to crime didn't really make a whole lot of sense, but he was a friend of Bruce Wayne's. And if you think about Tim Burton's Batmans, they put Batman in the courtroom. So similar to like Superman and BVS, he was there and could have saved him, and he blames himself because he didn't act fast enough. And so that adds a nice little twist to it too. So I think there's a lot there with his backstory. Threat level's a 6. Much like these other guys, can plan things, ruthless. But if you get kind of hand to hand with Batman or close, it's over. There's nothing they can really do with Batman. Popularity's a 6. I think that Tommy Lee Jones version hurt him a little bit, like I mentioned with other people. But it really helped him in being in The Dark Knight, even though the Joker really overtook that movie. But I think Two-Face is pretty popular and iconic. For most people, you got the black and white, the flipping the coin, you know, the heads or the tails type thing. And so I end up giving him a 6. And so overall, that gives him a 6.3. Then we got Green Goblin, and I'm going with Harry Osborn. Technically he wasn't the original, but I think that's the most well known. And so backstory, I gave a 5 though. Basically, Harry Osborn wanted to be in crime. I don't know why. He has a corporation and he's doing like big things, but he wanted to be in crime. And so they developed this equipment and stuff to try to take out Spider-Man to kind of allow him to become bigger in crime. So it's pretty surface level. And then the equipment ended up coming with the serum and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And so it was depicted a little different with the Sam Raimi Spider-Man, which I like a little more. Honestly, when you look at the origins of the comics, a lot of times, a lot of these movies do it better because they just write it better, but it's pretty surface level either way. He's get the serum, and well, in the movie, he kind of goes crazy from the serum, but in the comics, at least, he was just a bad dude. So, but he knows, obviously, Peter because Peter's friends with Harry, and so that adds another dimension. Threat level, threat level, I gave an 8. I would say, obviously, with his enhanced abilities, it definitely makes him a formidable opponent. And then you throw in Harry Osborn's resources. So, especially, not Harry, Norman. So, especially before you knew it was him, Norman, you know, he could do a lot. He's a powerful, rich person, and he could set up a lot of stuff. He knows a lot of people. And then throw on top of that, he's got this other persona that's very dangerous as well. So I gave him a threat level of 8. Popularity 7. And it might even be higher than that, but it was tough for me between a lot of people to say who is Spider-Man's top villain. And I think, for me personally, Green Goblin might be the most synonymous with Spider-Man for me, but I don't know if that's like that for everybody. But I gave him a 7. Obviously, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man. There's so many goblins. Like, obviously, there's a Hobgoblin who is hairy, but there's so many other goblins and new versions. And the Halloween aesthetic, I think, just makes him really popular. And so when you talk about Green Goblin, you know, goblins or whatever, and I think a lot of people know who he is, but he's very prominent and has a distinct look in the Spider-Man lore. So I gave him a 7, and that averages to 6.7. All right, so we are on our last one for this video, and that is Joker versus Venom. So let's start with the Joker. Backstory, I gave a 7. Here's my reasoning. Number one, Joker is cool. I get it because of the backstory, but I got to be fair in saying what we most popularly know Joker for is not having a backstory and a bunch of, well, maybe it could be. And I can't give that a full-fledged 10 because I could do that with anybody and just say, well, you know, we don't know, or we don't know what it is, or maybe it's not that. He doesn't have a particular, like, that's, I'm not saying it's lazy, but it's not complete either. So it's cool, but that gives you so many points. I gave him a 7 ultimately and not a 5 because we know some type of origins that have been thrown out there and they're developed and they're cool. Obviously the Jack Napier thing, also at one point him being the person that killed Bruce's parents potentially and all that stuff. So we got a lot of different theories out there, but nothing that's solid, and I can't really reward that, so I'm gonna give it a 7. Threat level, I gave it 8. Joker is a big time threat to Batman, mostly obviously because he's kind of the antithesis of him. He's not on the same moral constraints as Batman. And he can do some stuff with Batman. He is a trained killer, but we know hand to hand Batman's beating him, even though Joker will be dirty. Now, Joker has a lot of resources, has a lot of different things. He's been a problem for other people in the Justice League and in the DC as well. So his threat is big, but at the end of the day, it's a lot of manipulation. It's a lot of resources, like especially outside of Batman. Batman's one thing. If he's going against anybody else in the Justice League where he didn't set up a specific situation, they would just crush him. So I had to give him an 8. Couldn't give him a full 10 for that. Popularity 10. I mean, there's not even much to explain there. Joker is freaking everywhere all the time, and yeah. So overall, that averages to an 8.3. Venom backstory, I gave it 8. I like the Eddie Brock stuff a lot more. The whole symbiote stuff, or symbiote, whatever, however you want to say it, the whole thing about that coming from outer space is really whatever to me. Now, the idea of him, or of the Venom attaching to Eddie Brock and kind of taking on his characteristics and stuff, that to me is more cool. But on top of that, obviously it was with Peter Parker first, or Spider-Man, and it was rejected. And so you got Eddie Brock is they're both kind of drawn to each other because their dislike for Spider-Man. And so I think that's kind of cool too. But similar to Joker, he's kind of the anti-Spider-Man, more so than any of these other villains. And so a lot of similar things that Spider-Man can do, he can do because he took traits from him, but stronger and more ruthless. And so threat level is a 9 to me. Again, he can do everything Spider-Man can do. Some things a little better, but obviously he has a very big weakness that Spider-Man doesn't, and that's the vulnerability to sound. So there's that. And then popularity, a 7. I think most people know Venom. I wouldn't say he's iconic per se, but the new movie definitely helps. He took a huge hit with that Spider-Man 3 for a minute, but very prominent in the TV shows. Very big hit with the movie recently. I think a lot of people have Venom more on their radar. And then obviously he took that turn with the anti-hero stuff in the comics. So I think Venom is pretty well regarded. So overall, that averages out to an 8. All right, so that is it for this episode. And you see why I couldn't do all of them at once. That'd be a lot of talking. But that's it for this episode. Go to the comment section. Let me know what you think about each of those villains we discussed already, or your overall thoughts about the rogue galleries between Batman and Spider-Man. Again, look out for part 2 and 3. Those will be coming up within the next few weeks or so. I'll probably space it out a little bit. And then hopefully we'll finally determine at the end of the day which rogue gallery is the best. So again, thank you for listening. Share it around, get the conversation started. Thumbs up, subscribe, and if you heard it here, it's official canon.